Good afternoon, and welcome to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation's Meet the Scientist monthly webinar series. I'm Dr. Jeff Borenstein, President and CEO of the Foundation, and your host for today's webinar. Today, Dr. Amanda McCleery will present Cognitive Impairment in Psychosis, what it is and how it's treated. The Brain and Behavior Research Foundation funds the most innovative ideas in neuroscience and psychiatry to better understand the causes and develop new ways to treat brain and behavior disorders. These disorders include addiction, ADHD, anxiety, autism, bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, depression, eating disorders, OCD, post-traumatic stress, and schizophrenia. Since 1987, the Foundation has awarded more than $418 million to fund more than 6,000 grants around the world. I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Amanda McCleery. Dr. McCleery is an assistant professor in the Department of Psychological and Brain Sciences at the University of Iowa. She was the 2015 Young Investigator Grantee and the 2016 Maltz Prize winner for innovative and promising schizophrenia research. Today's webinar will begin with Dr. McCleery's presentation. This will be followed by a question and answer period. To submit your questions, please use the questions tab on the control panel on your screen. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time. Following the presentation, I will ask as many as possible in the time allotted. And now, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. McCleery. Amanda, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can everyone see my screen? Can I just get confirmation you can see the
Yes.
slides?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yep.
All right. Thank you so much. So let me just advance my slides here. So before I get started on my talk, I just wanted to present my disclosures. So I have received research funding from Alkermes for projects unrelated to the content of this presentation. I've also received payment from Metavante Prophase for clinical assessment services, also unrelated to the content of this presentation. So I know that thank you slides normally come at the end of a presentation, but I wanted to express my appreciation to the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation for inviting me to speak with you all today. It really is a big honor to be here. I also want to thank the supporters of BBRF. Your contributions fund groundbreaking science that aims to improve the lives of people with mental illness. In addition, the NARSAD Young Investigator Grants provide critical funding to early-stage investigators who are working to establish their programs of research. Thank you for your support. So the aim of my presentation today will be to provide a very broad overview of research that's examined cognitive impairment in schizophrenia, the pathway between cognition and daily functioning, and also treatment approaches in this area. The specific topics that I'm going to cover will include disability in schizophrenia, followed by cognition in schizophrenia. Specifically, I'll talk about the profile of impairment, the developmental course, and the relationship between cognition and disability. Then I'll talk about important intervening factors along the pathway between cognition and functioning. And then we're going to link it all back to clinical practice by talking about treatment approaches. Much of this presentation is based on a paper that I published with Keith Nectarline and a forthcoming book chapter with Michael Green, where I reviewed and summarized this literature. Many of you submitted questions in advance, and I thank you for that. And I tried to weave as many of those questions into the presentation as I could. I'm also happy to answer other questions at the end of the webinar if time permits. When we think about schizophrenia, psychotic symptoms reflecting distortions in perception, such as hallucinations, distortions in thought content, such as delusions, and disorganized communication and behaviors are typically the features that come to mind. We're very fortunate to have effective treatments for these psychotic symptoms. Antipsychotic medications were first introduced in the 1950s, and we now have more than 24 antipsychotic medications available. These medications have made a tremendous impact on clinical outcomes, and these medications do a good job at reducing symptoms of psychosis. However, we haven't seen a commensurate improvement in functional outcomes. And by functional outcomes, I'm referring to things like the quantity and quality of one's social relationships, one's success at work or school, being able to live independently, and engaging in activities that the person finds enriching and fulfilling. Indeed, despite its advances in the treatment of psychosis, schizophrenia remains a leading cause of disability for young adults, and it accounts for about 1.5% of the disability-adjusted life years, or DALYs, in adults aged 25 to 49. DALYs are a metric used by the World Health Organization to index the overall burden of disease, and it's interpreted as the number of years lost due to ill health, disability, or early death. Psychotic symptoms are highly distressing and they capture clinical attention, but we now know that after the initial psychotic episode, the relationship between psychotic symptoms and community functioning is actually fairly weak. So functional recovery depends on factors outside of psychotic symptoms, such as cognition. And gaining a better understanding of the predictors of community functioning is critical for development of recovery-oriented treatments. This gives us a target for our interventions. So this brings us to a major change in the way that schizophrenia is conceptualized. In the last 2 decades, there's been increasing recognition of the cognitive impact of the disorder. Although it isn't included in the DSM-5 criteria, impaired cognition is a core feature of schizophrenia, and it's quite common. It impacts an estimated 80% of people with the diagnosis. Even when performance falls within normal limits or better, it's been argued that individuals with schizophrenia still perform at levels that fall below expectations. And evidence for this notion comes from studies of twins who are discordant for schizophrenia, from studies comparing actual cognitive performance to expected performance based on the person's level of intellectual functioning prior to the onset of their illness, and from studies of people who have a diagnosis of schizophrenia and also have intellectual abilities in the superior range. So this brings me to the first question that I received from the audience earlier. Is there an objective test to determine cognitive dysfunction? The answer here is yes, absolutely. So in a clinical or a healthcare setting, we would refer to these cognitive assessments as a neuropsychological evaluation. Here, the aim of the assessment is to answer a specific referral question, and typically this referral question comes from a physician. So an example might be, does this patient have significant memory impairment following a stroke? Or does this patient have ADHD? Or does this patient have dementia? This type of evaluation is typically conducted by a specialist called a neuropsychologist. This is a clinical psychologist with advanced training in neuropsychology. And they administer a comprehensive battery of standardized and well-validated cognitive tests. This type of evaluation may take several hours to complete, and it may be conducted over multiple sessions. And the idea here is to test the person's limits in various cognitive domains to get an idea about their strengths and weaknesses. The neuropsychologist will then synthesize and interpret the data and provide individualized feedback and recommendations in the form of a written report. So what about cognitive assessment in research settings? So for research, we tend to use similar tests to assess cognitive performance, but the test batteries are typically much briefer, so they are practical to include in a study. For many years, the field was limited by a lack of consensus regarding best practices for the assessment of cognition in schizophrenia for the purpose of research studies. And this was true both with respect to the relevant cognitive domains that we should be assessing and with which specific tests we should be administering to assess these domains. This meant that different studies examined different aspects of cognition, and they used different tests to assess those aspects of cognition. And these tests vary in terms of their psychometric properties and their sensitivity to detect changes in cognitive performance. So this meant that clinical trials of potential cognitive enhancing agents and therapies didn't have a common measurement of cognition. So as you can imagine, this presented a change not only for interpreting results of individual studies, but also to compare results across studies. It was a little bit like comparing apples to oranges. The NIMH sought to remedy this in 2004 when they established the Measurement and Treatment Research to Improve Cognition in Schizophrenia, or the MATRICS Initiative. This initiative involved a series of consensus meetings with experts from academia, industry, and government to try to get a consensus about the important cognitive domains that are important for us to assess in treatment trials and which tests we should use to assess those domains. A key product of the MATRICS initiative was the MATRICS Consensus Cognitive Battery, or the MCCB. This is a collection of cognitive tests that's now recommended by the FDA, NIH, and NIMH as a cognitive assessment battery for use in clinical trials. On this slide, I have the cognitive domains identified by the MATRICS initiative listed on the left, and description of the skills associated with each domain on the right. So speed of processing refers to our ability to process information quickly and accurately. Attention and vigilance refers to our ability to sustain focus and attention on a task for long periods of time. Working memory refers to our ability to hold on to information for brief periods of time and to manipulate that information. So a real-world example would be something like doing mental math to calculate how much of a tip you should leave at a restaurant. Verbal learning and visual learning refer to acquiring and retaining new visual or verbal information. So for example, remembering a shopping list from memory or remembering where you parked your car at the shopping center. Reasoning and problem solving refer to the ability to plan ahead and to navigate potential obstacles. And social cognition refers to the ability to understand the emotional and mental states of other people and to use social information adaptively. In this figure, I have the MATRICS domains plotted along the x-axis, and I've set the MCCB performance for a sample of adults without mental illness to the 0 line. So this serves as the normative sample. As a group, people with chronic phase schizophrenia typically perform about 1 to 2 standard deviations below the normative sample across the MATRICS domains. So this leads to the next audience question that I received. Do cognitive impairments in schizophrenia look the same or different from other mental health conditions? So the performance pattern that we tend to see in schizophrenia is a diffuse pattern that impacts a variety of cognitive domains, ranging from lower order perceptual processing up through higher order executive functions. Comprehensive quantitative reviews that synthesize findings across studies or meta-analyses report large effects across cognitive domains. Notably, cognitive performance does not appear to be substantially impacted by clinical factors such as duration of psychotic illness or severity of psychotic symptoms, nor is it attributable to the effects of medications. And I say this because cognitive impairment is also consistently reported in studies of people who are not taking medications at the time of the cognitive testing, and among those who have never taken antipsychotic medications during their illness. One thing that I want to point out is that I'm speaking broadly here about group differences. So comparing the average performance of a group of people with schizophrenia to the average performance of a group of people without schizophrenia or with a different psychiatric condition. But it's important to note that there is a lot of variability in performance among members of each group, and that portions of the distributions of cognitive scores for each group are going to overlap with each other. So what this means is that there's going to be people in each group who exhibit high or low cognitive performance, but the group averages, which is represented here by the vertical lines in the middle of each distribution, are different from each other. So again, referring to group differences, we tend to see less impairment in affective psychoses like bipolar disorder, but again, there's a lot of variability within the groups. To illustrate these group differences, here in gray, I've plotted the MCCB profile from a recent meta-analysis of cognitive performance in bipolar disorder. And you can see here that the performance for the bipolar group is somewhat intermediate between the performance of the schizophrenia group in dark blue and the non-psychiatric comparison group, which is represented by the 0 line. So while the pathophysiology of cognitive impairment is still being worked out, there's converging evidence implicating disruptions during neurodevelopment that impact synaptic receptors, neurotransmitter systems, and neuroplasticity. We also see evidence for altered structure and function of neurons, circuits, and brain regions. And we also see reduced coordination between different brain regions and different circuits. I received quite a few questions asking about the timeline for cognitive impairment and whether these impairments were neurodevelopmental in nature or neurodegenerative. And that's what we're going to talk about in this next section of the presentation. So this actually leads us to the next major shift in the field, reframing schizophrenia as a neurodevelopmental disorder. So the illness is typically diagnosed in late adolescence or early adulthood at the onset of frank psychotic symptoms. And so these symptoms are what typically necessitate clinical intervention, and that's when the person would receive a diagnosis. However, oftentimes there were early warning signs of psychosis that may have emerged in the months or years preceding the onset of psychosis. So these types of early warning signs would be sort of lower level or sub-threshold psychotic-like experiences that seem kind of similar to psychosis but aren't quite as severe. We also know that there are subtle disturbances that emerge early in childhood with respect to cognitive, motor, and social development. This occurs many years before there's any hint of psychosis. And so what this suggests is that the processes associated with schizophrenia start quite early in life, and they unfold across development. So one question that researchers have wrestled with regarding the developmental course of schizophrenia is about the stability of cognitive impairment. So does cognition progressively deteriorate over the course of illness, or is it relatively stable? A second question concerns the timing of the onset of cognitive impairment during the illness. So specifically, are cognitive impairments present at the onset of psychosis? Or perhaps does cognitive impairment precede the onset of psychosis? Regarding the stability of cognitive performance, the bulk of the available evidence supports stability of cognitive performance in people with established illness. So for example, a comprehensive meta-analytic review of 53 studies found no significant decline in cognitive performance over follow-up periods of about a year. Similarly, there's evidence for relative stability in cognitive performance for the majority of older adults with schizophrenia. However, there is evidence for a deteriorating course for a subset of older adults who also have risk factors, including having a long history of not living independently, having very high levels of negative symptoms, and having an early age of illness onset. The question of when cognitive impairment arises can be addressed indirectly with cross-sectional studies. So these are studies that compare cognitive performance in groups of people who are at different stages of the illness. So for example, comparing people who are in the early stage of illness to individuals at the later stage of illness. And we can also examine this more directly with longitudinal studies where the same individuals are repeatedly assessed over time. Cross-sectional studies indicate the presence of a marked cognitive impairment at the onset of psychosis, with large effect sizes across cognitive domains in people with recent onset schizophrenia. And the magnitude of impairment is very similar to what we observe in chronic phase schizophrenia. Longitudinal studies of recent onset schizophrenia also support stability of cognitive impairment over follow-up periods of 1 to 10 years. So the upshot here is that the bulk of the evidence indicates that cognitive impairment is present at the start of the illness and does not support significant deterioration of cognitive performance during the transition between early and more chronic phases of illness. So here I illustrate I've plotted the MCCB profile for a large sample of people with recent onset schizophrenia in light blue. And as you can see, the profile is very similar to what we observe for the group with chronic phase schizophrenia indicated in dark blue. So we've established that cognitive impairment is present at illness onset. What about before the onset of psychosis? To answer this question, we now turn to research conducted with clinical high-risk individuals. So these are young people who exhibit early warning signs of psychosis. And usually what this means is that they're exhibiting attenuated or sub-threshold psychotic-like experiences. These individuals look like they're on course towards a diagnosis of schizophrenia, but they're not quite there yet. Cross-sectional studies suggest that cognitive performance in clinical high risk is somewhat intermediate between what we would observe in non-psychiatric control participants and people with schizophrenia. However, an issue here is that there's a lot of heterogeneity with respect to clinical outcomes in clinical high risk. So the vast majority of those who are identified as being at risk do not go on to develop schizophrenia. Recent estimates suggest that about 20% of these clinical high-risk individuals will develop schizophrenia over a 2-year follow-up period. As such, there's a lot of people who are identified as being on the trajectory towards illness who actually don't go on to develop schizophrenia. So we might expect that the cognitive performance might look a little different between these two subgroups that are within the larger CHR group. Few studies have compared the cognitive profile of those who eventually convert to psychosis to those who do not. However, one study did report a similar matrix performance profile in the clinical high-risk converter group and a recent onset schizophrenia group. Longitudinal studies with follow-up periods of 2 to 10 years do not provide significant evidence for progressive decline in clinical high risk. However, it's important to note that this is a really small literature. So the magnitude of cognitive impairment in the period preceding the onset of psychosis and whether there is significant decline in cognitive performance during the transition into psychosis is still very much an open question. So if we synthesize the information from the last few slides, I think we can safely say that cognitive impairment is present at the onset of illness, that it precedes the onset of psychosis, although perhaps to a smaller magnitude, and that for the most part, it appears to be relatively stable after the first episode of psychosis. So now let's turn to the link between cognition and community functioning or disability. The relationship between cognition and community functioning is well established in the literature. The strength of the association is small to moderate for individual cognitive domains and is a little stronger for cognitive composite scores. This is a pretty robust finding in that it's been replicated by research groups around the globe using a variety of cognitive tests and with diverse participant samples. The relationship between cognition and functioning is evident early in the illness course and among those who are at clinical high risk. And longitudinal studies demonstrate that the relationship holds over time, with cognitive impairment predicting later community functioning over follow-up periods ranging from 6 months to 4 years. So taken together, this work suggests that cognition is a potential treatment target to improve functional recovery in people with schizophrenia. So we've established the link between cognition and functioning. The next question is to understand the potential mechanisms by which cognition exerts an influence on functioning. This line of research can point us towards additional therapeutic targets beyond cognition that are more proximal to community functioning. So in the next section, I'm going to briefly discuss 3 important intervening factors along this pathway that have been identified: social cognition, defeatist beliefs, and negative symptoms. Social cognition refers to the mental operations that underlie social interactions. The areas that have been studied most extensively in schizophrenia include emotion processing, theory of mind, and that refers to understanding the mental states of other people, and social cue perception and attributional style. As a group, people with schizophrenia tend to exhibit social cognitive impairment with large effect sizes across social cognitive domains. So here we can use our social cognition skills to do a little bit of detective work. What's happening here? We see that there is a man and that he's crying, but it's not clear why. Based on the limited information that we have, we might hypothesize that he is feeling sad or upset, or perhaps that he's in physical pain. As we get more context, we see that he's looking at the woman in the wedding dress and that she's walking towards him. We also pick up on other cues, so for example, that he's wearing a tux. We can start to integrate these pieces of information and make guesses about the nature of their relationship. So maybe he's the groom and he's about to marry that woman. And if that's the case, then we should probably revise our assessment of his emotional state. And he's probably not sad after all. Maybe he's tearful because he's really happy. We can also start to imagine what he might be thinking or feeling. He's probably feeling excited and maybe a bit nervous. Maybe he's thinking about their future, or maybe he's just feeling relieved that she showed up. For someone with schizophrenia, it might be difficult to rapidly identify, process, and integrate each of the social cues that we just went over. And as a result, they may be more likely to miss important information and may come to different conclusions during social interactions. Social cognition is associated with functioning, with a large meta-analytic review reporting a small but significant association between all domains of social cognition and functional outcomes. This relationship is sustained over time across follow-up periods ranging from 1 to 5 years. And social cognition is linked to daily functioning, with 2 separate meta-analytic reviews supporting the role of social cognition as a mediator between cognition and community functioning. These types of models are informative because they can explain somewhere between 10 to 25% of the variance in community functioning. The next intervening factor is defeatist beliefs. This refers to a type of dysfunctional attitude where an individual holds generalized negative beliefs about their ability to successfully perform tasks. We assess these beliefs using self-report questionnaires like the Dysfunctional Attitude Scale. And here on this slide, I have a couple of example items from the scale. So if I do not do as well as other people, it means that I am an inferior human being. People should have a reasonable likelihood of success before undertaking anything. So you can imagine that if you hold beliefs like these very strongly, you would probably start to adopt a why bother trying attitude. In his cognitive model of schizophrenia, Aaron Beck posits that impaired ability to successfully engage in activities, for example, due to cognitive impairment, leads to discouraging life experiences, which in turn leads to development of negative and dysfunctional attitudes and beliefs. And as these beliefs become entrenched, they are hypothesized to contribute to reduced motivation and drive to engage in activities and to poor functioning. Defeatist beliefs are associated with daily functioning in people with schizophrenia. Moreover, a 2009 study from Beck's group linked cognition, defeatist beliefs, and daily functioning together and found support for defeatist beliefs as a mediator in the model. Subsequent work indicates that, consistent with Beck's cognitive model, the pathway between cognition, defeatist beliefs, and functioning involves additional intervening factors, including negative symptoms, which we're going to talk about next. So negative symptoms are often grouped into two clusters: expressive symptoms, which refer to the outward expression of emotion through facial expressions, tone of voice, and body movements, and experiential symptoms, which refer to reduced motivation and drive to engage in activities, and it's expressed as disinterest, avolition, and anhedonia that impacts activities, socialization, and self-care. Negative symptoms, especially experiential negative symptoms, are associated with cognition and daily functioning, with a large meta-analytic review reporting a small but significant association between cognitive performance and negative symptoms, a moderate association between negative symptoms and daily functioning, and negative symptoms partially mediating the relationship between cognition and daily functioning. It's important to note that this is not intended to be an exhaustive list of intervening factors along the pathway, but the three that I covered are the ones that have received the most research attention. There's still a lot of unexplained variance in community functioning, and undoubtedly there are a number of important factors along this pathway between cognition and functioning that I did not cover. In addition, although I've been talking about these factors mostly in isolation, the relationships between the factors are undoubtedly more complicated and may involve multi-step pathways, bidirectional relationships, and so on. It's also likely that there are multiple pathways between cognition and functioning. So this leads me to the next audience question, which brings us into the final portion of the presentation, where we're going to discuss treatment developments. So can cognitive impairments be treated? Can they be prevented? So here in this section, I'm going to briefly cover interventions that aim to improve daily functioning in schizophrenia by targeting impaired cognition directly or by targeting the proposed mechanisms that we just talked about. So specifically, we'll talk about pharmacological agents, cognitive training, physical exercise, neurostimulation, social cognition skills training, CBT for defeatist beliefs, and psychotherapy for negative symptoms. So one way that we can target cognition is via pharmacological agents that act on the neurotransmitter systems that are disrupted in schizophrenia and are believed to be associated with cognitive performance. These pharmacological studies will vary in terms of the comparison condition. So for example, comparing to placebo or to a different type of medication. They'll also vary in terms of whether they're examining the immediate effects of a single dose of the drug. So these types of studies are typically referred to as challenge studies versus the enduring effects of repeated administration of the drug in a treatment trial. When we look at the findings from treatment studies across all different types of pharmacological agents, we tend to see very small effects of these medications on cognitive performance. However, when we break it down by neurotransmitter system, we start to see a signal for working memory from agents that act on the cholinergic system and the glutamatergic systems. Notably, the literature in this area is still relatively small and more work is needed. In addition, pharmacological treatment studies may be somewhat underpowered to detect treatment effects, and sometimes the duration of treatment may be too brief for improvements in cognition to occur. In addition, I sometimes wonder if we might be expecting a little bit too much from pharmacological agents. So it may be that a medication on its own may be somewhat insufficient to dramatically improve cognition, but perhaps if we combine these agents with opportunities to learn, that would be a more effective strategy. In this case, the drug may set the stage for optimal learning and increase the potential for treatment gains. So this leads to a really important question that I received from one of the registrants. What about antipsychotic medications? Do they help or do they hurt cognition? So one question that has come up is whether cognitive impairments that we see in schizophrenia are just simply a side effect of antipsychotic medications. To answer this question, we have strong evidence that cognitive impairment is what we refer to as primary. So this means that impaired cognition is a feature of the disorder itself and is not a side effect or caused by medications. There's lots of converging lines of evidence to support this, including what I discussed earlier, the presence of cognitive impairment at the illness onset before antipsychotic medications have been initiated, and also the presence of cognitive impairments among people who have never taken antipsychotic medications throughout the course of their illness. Another question is whether antipsychotics can help or hinder cognition. So there is some evidence that some antipsychotic medications can yield modest benefits for cognitive performance, and additional evidence that some atypical antipsychotics and some long-acting injectables may also be somewhat neuroprotective. However, that being said, we also know that antipsychotic medications can negatively impact cognitive performance through side effects like sedation, or when they're prescribed at very high doses and there's high occupancy of the D2 receptors. We can also see an impact on cognition when antipsychotic medications are used in conjunction with other types of medications, including anti-Parkinsonian medicines. So here, if this is something that you are concerned about, either for yourself or for your loved one, I would encourage you to consult with your physician and the treatment team. I also received some questions about nutritional supplements, over-the-counter medications, and complementary and alternative medicine approaches. For these questions, I would refer you to consult with your physician and your treatment team, and to look at reliable sources about the current status of the evidence for these types of interventions. So for example, Cochrane reviews or peer-reviewed research. So let's move on now to cognitive training, or CT. The main idea with CT is to train the brain with structured activities to improve cognitive performance. And there are two broad approaches here. The restorative approach aims to shore up impaired cognitive skills through repeated practice. This is also sometimes referred to as a neuroplasticity-based approach. And the analogy here is that we're sort of trying to improve cognition similarly to trying to build up a muscle with repeated weight training. A compensatory approach involves using strategies and environmental supports to sidestep impairments. So an analogy here would be like using a walking cane to steady one's gait. CT methods can vary in terms of their relative emphasis on training low-level perceptual processes versus higher-order cognitive processes. The treatment format for CT is often computerized, but not always. And the format may be in groups or it may be individualized. And then finally, these CT programs may also include a bridging component. This is where participants discuss the skills that they learn in CT and how they can apply these skills to their daily life. And the aim here of the bridging groups are to promote generalization of the skills that are learned in the lab, from the trained CT tasks to untrained tasks that tap into similar cognitive skills. So this is sometimes referred to as near transfer of skills, and also more broadly to less closely related cognitive skills and to community functioning. And this is sometimes referred to in the literature as far transfer. Cognitive training has been studied for many years, and it is an empirically supported treatment for schizophrenia. The evidence indicates that CT does yield improved cognitive performance, but there are some methodological limitations of some of the studies that have been conducted to date. However, when we synthesize the findings across studies that use a variety of CT approaches and formats, the treatment effects are in the moderate range for overall cognition and in the small to moderate range for specific cognitive domains. Notably, while gains on trained tasks and cognitive domains are observed, it can be difficult to get the improvements to transfer to untrained cognitive tasks or to see sizable improvements in community functioning. Further research is needed to increase the methodological rigor of CT treatment trials, to identify characteristics of effective CT programs, and to investigate whether a personalized approach where the CT program is custom tailored to the individual's cognitive strengths and weaknesses is warranted. We also need to identify ways to enhance the near and far transfer of treatment gains. Physical exercise is another exciting treatment approach to target cognition. The idea here is that exercise may support cognition through increased neurogenesis, or growing new neurons essentially, improved cerebrovascular and cardiovascular fitness, and by reducing inflammation. Studies in this area may differ with regard to their exercise approach. So, for example, using high intensity interval training, cardio, weight training, walking, yoga, and so on. This is a pretty small literature, but the results so far have been quite promising. Specifically, there's indications for positive effects of aerobic exercise on overall cognitive ability and working memory, social cognition, and also attention. I want to briefly mention results from a preliminary study conducted at UCLA that combined cognitive training and exercise together. The idea here is to try to optimize learning potential through exercise-induced neurogenesis and enhanced neuroplasticity, and to provide the opportunity to learn with cognitive training. This study compared cognitive training alone and cognitive training plus exercise in people with recent onset schizophrenia, and the treatment was provided over a 6-month period. What they found was that the combined treatment yielded larger improvements in overall cognition and in reasoning and problem solving specifically at 3 months. These cognitive gains were correlated with an early increase in brain-derived neurotrophic factor. This is a protein that supports the growth of new neurons. Functioning was also improved at 6 months in the CT&E group, and this improvement was predicted by cognitive gains at 3 months. In addition, the cognitive training and exercise intervention was also associated with structural and functional brain changes, and these changes were associated with improvements in cognition and functioning. Specifically, the researchers observed increased resting state connectivity and increased cortical thickness in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the superior frontal gyrus. Another approach to target cognition is via non-invasive neurostimulation. And the main idea here is to apply electrical or magnetic stimulation over the scalp to alter the likelihood that neurons will fire and to modulate the synaptic plasticity in that particular brain region. Considerations for this type of treatment include selection of target sites or the brain regions that are going to be stimulated, whether the researchers are looking at the immediate effects of stimulation versus enduring changes, and whether the stimulation regimen, so whether stimulation occurred over a single session or if it was repeated over time. This is also a very small literature, but the results so far suggest that repeated stimulation across sessions to frontal areas of the brain can yield improvements in working memory performance. Moreover, there's some limited evidence for enduring effects of TMS over follow-up periods of 2 to 12 weeks. Again, this is a very small literature and more studies are needed to determine whether this is a reliable effect, but the findings are intriguing. Now let's turn our attention to treatments that target the intervening factors. So social skills training, or SST, is an empirically supported treatment for schizophrenia that involves using instruction, role play exercises, and cognitive behavioral strategies to target interpersonal skills. Social cognition training is a somewhat different approach, and it's actually more similar to cognitive training, or CT, but it focuses on improving the processing of social information through repeated practice and strategies. So for example, to train identification of facial emotions, the person might be presented with pictures of faces and they're asked to select which emotion the person is expressing. And then they're given trial by trial feedback about their performance so that they can improve with practice. Social cognition training may be administered individually or in groups, and it may involve live instruction or computerized training programs, and it may also include some kind of bridging component. This is a small literature, but the evidence so far indicates that social cognition training yields medium to large improvements in social cognition domains, including emotion identification performance, theory of mind, and social perception. There's also a signal for positive effects on functioning, but this finding is based on a very small number of studies that also varied quite a bit in their findings. So more work is needed to establish the generalizability of treatment gains from social cognition training to community functioning. Notably, the results from a randomized control trial suggest that there is potential benefit of augmenting learning during social cognition training with oxytocin. This is a neuropeptide that's believed to increase the salience of social information. And this is an area under active investigation by Dr. Stephen Martyr at UCLA. Defeatist beliefs may be amenable to change through cognitive behavioral therapy. So the idea here is to use CBT techniques to help the person to generate alternative thoughts to the defeatist beliefs that are more balanced and adaptive. The few studies that have been conducted so far indicate that CBT is quite effective for reducing defeatist beliefs in people with schizophrenia. And changes in defeatist beliefs are associated with improved community functioning. So now we're going to turn to our remaining intervening factor, negative symptoms. So negative symptoms show a relatively strong association with daily functioning. And so we might get more bang for our buck in terms of functional recovery if we can alleviate negative symptoms. However, negative symptoms are challenging to change, and no evidence-based interventions for negative symptoms currently exist. CBT has been tested as a potential intervention in this regard, and while CBT does yield small improvements in functioning, the effect on negative symptoms is quite small. possible that alternative CBT-informed treatments may be more effective for negative symptoms than CBT alone. So for example, combining CBT with an intervention that targets enhancing motivation and fostering commitment to engage, such as motivational interviewing. Preliminary results of a randomized control trial that was conducted by Felice Reddy at the West Los Angeles VA tested a combined motivational interviewing and CBT intervention and reported a significant reduction in negative symptoms at the end of treatment. And the gains were still evident 3 months after treatment ended. So throughout this presentation, I've mentioned a number of different interventions. Many of them are still in the investigational phase, which means that they're not yet widely available, but they may be offered in the context of research studies. I received a few questions about how to access such treatments. If you would like to learn more about treatment studies or other types of research available in your area, I would encourage you to check out clinicaltrials.gov. This is a repository of clinical trials. You can enter search terms. So for example, here I entered schizophrenia and cognition, and you can filter the results by the status of the study, so whether it's currently recruiting or not, the location, and so on. You may also consider joining a research registry if one is available nearby. And to find these, I would suggest checking out the websites of research faculty at the local university or psychiatric institute, or you can ask your mental health treatment provider if opportunities for clinical research are available in the area. I also received some questions about how best to support functional recovery. So for example, to identify strategies that would be helpful for someone with schizophrenia who is planning to return to work or school. Here, I would direct you to the literature surrounding supported education and employment. This is also known as individualized placement and support, or IPS. IPS is an empirically supported treatment for schizophrenia. It involves integrating employment or education with mental health services. It involves job or school placement and provision of ongoing occupational or educational supports. So if we take the example of someone who is planning to return to school, this might look like ongoing communication between the client, their IPS worker, student accessibility services at the university, and their instructors to ensure that appropriate academic supports are in place and to set the student up for success. So we've covered a lot today. My aim was to provide a very broad overview of the literature surrounding cognition in schizophrenia, the relationship to disability, and current treatment approaches. To summarize, schizophrenia is associated with significant disability and cognitive impairment. Impaired cognition is evident at the onset of psychosis, and it's also present at some level before the illness onset. Cognitive impairment is relatively stable over the course of illness, with a subset of individuals it's exhibiting a deteriorating trajectory later in life. Impaired cognition is associated with functional impairments. Intervening factors along the pathway from functioning between cognition and functioning include social cognition, defeatist beliefs, and negative symptoms. And we reviewed the rationale behind these different recovery-focused interventions and the evidence base for them regarding targeting impaired cognition and the intervening factors. Overall, the results are encouraging, but a common theme that has emerged is that more work is needed to try to improve the generalizability of effects beyond trained tasks and to community functioning. I want to thank you so much for your attention, and I will turn it back to Jeff.
Amanda, thank you so much for the work that you've done and for this outstanding presentation. You really brought a lot of information to the table in what I think is a very user-friendly way. So thank you. Extremely important topic. And One of the questions that we received a number of times relates to the number of episodes that somebody has of acute psychosis and how that may relate to cognitive functioning and other areas of functioning. Is there any information that you have on that, and any information about the importance of trying to minimize the risk of an exacerbation of acute illness?
Yes, absolutely. So, in terms of whether successive episodes of psychosis are neurotoxic or not, that's still something that's being investigated. But I think undoubtedly each episode of psychosis is extremely disruptive for the person's life, right? And minimizing those disruptions is important for maintaining good functioning and for engaging in activities that the person finds meaningful and so that they can live independently. We do see evidence that maintaining medication management over time has good implications for cognition and for functional outcomes.
Good, excellent, excellent. And you spoke about some of the research and how to find research to get involved in a research protocol. How about just clinical treatment? What's the best way for a person to have cognitive training or get involved? What, just as a treatment, not as a research protocol, but to get that kind of treatment?
Right, yeah. So number one, I would suggest checking out clinicaltrials.gov just to see if there is a treatment trial that's offered in your area that you can enroll in. That would be one option. Many of these cognitive training programs are commercially available, and so you can purchase access on your own and complete them from home. The thing to keep in mind is that when you're completing cognitive training as part of a comprehensive treatment program, there's sort of supports to help people stay engaged with the training, and also to provide opportunities for those bridging exercises to help to try to generalize those skills to other cognitive domains and to daily life. So if you're doing this on your own, looking for those opportunities, I think, is really key. In terms of other types of treatment resources, for folks who are sort of early on in the illness course, there are specialized programs for early psychosis around the country that offer comprehensive evidence-based services. And I'll be happy to include links to directories of those programs in the PowerPoint slides that get posted on the website.
Great, great. Thank you. Very helpful. Finally, one last question. Where do you see this going in 5 years from now, 10 years from now? Where do you see the field moving in terms of hope for people moving forward?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of energetic research in these recovery-oriented treatments. I think what we're going to see is combining these treatments to try to get synergistic effects on cognition and functioning. I think we're going to see an increased emphasis on personalized medicine as well. So like I hinted at before with cognitive training, identifying an individual's cognitive strengths and weaknesses and tailoring programs for that individual to try to boost treatment effects, I think is where we're going next.
Great. Well, Amanda, I want to again thank you for an outstanding presentation. I think from my perspective, the bottom line of your presentation is that we want to bring everything to bear to help a person. It's not just treating the psychosis, but it's treating other aspects of their functioning to get a person to really be able to live at their highest level and have a full and productive and happy life. So thank you for all that you're doing.
Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today.
You're welcome. You're welcome. I also want to thank everybody who joined us today. 100% of all donor contributions for research are invested in our grants to scientists. All of the research we fund is made possible through supporters like you. So please consider making a gift by visiting our website, bbrfoundation.org, or calling 1-800-829-8289. This webinar has been recorded. If you've missed any portion or would like to share with family and friends, please visit the events and webinars page on our website. And I hope you'll join us again next month when Dr. Laura Berner, Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, will present Self-Control Gone Awry, the cognitive neuroscience behind bulimia nervosa. This webinar will take place on Tuesday, August 10th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Once again, thank you for joining us. Stay well. Take care.